Hello, everybody. My name is Marguerite Tabato, and I am the Assistant Director of the CVI project at Perkins. And today I'm going to be talking about building concept development and really looking at accessibility for children who have cerebral/cortical visual impairment. So what is concept development? It's the understanding of knowledge or formulated thought that provides a background for future learning. And this can include ideas about the self and others, objects, and the environment. And essentially, it's really the basis of how we understand every element of our world. And we start building concept development the moment we're born. I'd like to share a story that happened to me a few years ago with my daughter. When my daughter was young, we would read this book, Click, Clack, Moo, multiple times a day, every day. And she would look at the pictures, she would laugh, label the animals. And then one day, she spontaneously looked at this particular picture and said, "Owl sitting on a chicken's head." So while I was initially surprised by the comment and definitely laughed, I immediately saw why she had said it. You can distinctly make out the oval body and the pointy ears of an owl. She had never seen a cow from this perspective with this very abstract level of shading, so she was unable to make the visual leap that that was still a cow, even though it was facing away from her. Now, my daughter had never seen a real owl or even a real photograph of one, but there was one owl that she was very, very familiar with. And that owl was O from the very popular children's show, Daniel Tiger. And so when she looked at this picture of the cow, she immediately saw familiar shape in O, and the shading was a little bit blue. And so therefore, she misidentified him. She didn't misidentify the chicken because that silhouette is very clear and you see the salient features of the chicken. And really what this whole story tells us is that we use what we know and we rely on what we know to tackle new information. For children with CVI, they miss and misidentify visual information all the time. And they really demonstrate difficulty with visual attention or recognition, which is often dependent on visual accessibility of information. So whether that be the distance, how far or near it is in proximity to them, color, the complexity of the environment, where in the visual field is it presented, is it accessible? It depends on the familiarity with the information, the amount of explicit instruction, sensory complexity, the impact of clutter in the environment and crowding, and impaired motion perception. So what this all tells us is looking is not understanding. You can look at something and not truly understand what you are seeing. When we're thinking about concepts, concepts are different than skills. A child may look, point, reach, take, or label something, but it doesn't mean that that concept is solidified. In reading this story with my own child who does not have CVI, I've been reading it for weeks thinking that she knew that that was a cow and understood the pictures. But she didn't. And it was that spontaneous language that cued me in to her understanding of what the concept of a cow or an owl was. So really, it told me that my daughter's concept of an owl was not solidified, maybe more so than a cow, but that both were really still in the early stages of understanding. So when you think about the basic concept of just an owl, you start with identification and categorization. So you know that it's living, it's an animal, it's a bird. It's a bird because it has feathers, wings, and a beak. It's an owl because it is bigger than most birds. It has two large circular eyes on the front of its face and two triangle ears on the top of its head. You can make the guess that the owl would feel soft if you were to pet it from top to bottom. You could also make the guess that the feathers would separate if you were to pet it from bottom to top. And you can look at it and imagine the sound it makes, which would be a typical hoo-hoo. So all of the language on this slide represent concepts, and all the ones in bold describe an owl or an interaction with an owl, and it builds a much richer concept. I personally have never pet an owl, but I can look at a photo of an owl, see that it has feathers, tie it to my past experience to actually feeling feathers, and make that leap that that owl must be soft because of the feathers. So in order to develop really rich concepts, you have to have many, many sensory experiences. So that involves looking, listening, feeling, tasting, smelling. And then you need to be able to retain those memories, which is often more accomplishable if you are having repeat access. Then you need to take those memories from past experiences and apply them to new experiences. And this forms another layer of a concept. And then you go back to the beginning. You have more experiences to give you more knowledge and understanding, and the concept builds. Concepts build outwards and upwards, and it's continuous. For children with visual impairments, there are three primary areas of limitations. There's a loss in the range and variety of experiences. There's restriction in the ability to move around and gain access to objects and other people, interacting with objects or other people. There's a loss of control in the environment and the relation of the self to it. Early concepts are developed through two primary ways. There's the repeat incidental observations. So just watching the world around you, watching objects, watching people interacting in events and objects in the environment. And these visual observations tie in with auditory experiences. You could look at somebody using a blender, see them press the button, hear the noise. That visual information has now been tied to an auditory experience. And then there's repeat direct sensory experiences. So having the active ability to look and really analyze it, touch something, manipulate it while looking, listening to the sounds it makes, smelling it, or tasting it. So children with visual impairment, specifically CVI in this case, don't have access to incidental learning. They're unable to just watch the comings and goings of their environment and learn about objects and interactions through passive observation. So they really rely on that repeat direct sensory experience, being able to look, to touch, to manipulate, listen, smell, and taste. So with that in mind, I'd like to think about how an experience would look during a snack preparation routine for a child who has sight versus a child who has CVI. So in this case, I'd like you to think about a parent or a caregiver standing about 10 feet away in the kitchen prepping a banana for a child's snack. So with visual access, the child could look at that distance of 10 feet, watch the parent pick up a bunch of yellow bananas, watch the parent rip a banana off of a bunch, watch the parent peel off the outside piece by piece, watch the parent extract that long white inside, watch them use a knife to cut the banana into pieces, watch the parent place it on a plate and put it in front of them. They're able to then look at those small white pieces that came from that original yellow banana. They're able to smell the scent, feel the slimy, mushy texture as they pick it up, and then they taste the flavor and feel the oral texture as they chew. So how does that compare to the experience of a child who has CVI? The first 5 steps in that process can be implicated by difficulty with distance viewing. All of that competing background information makes those individual objects and people inaccessible. The movement of the people may be difficult to distinguish. Being able to separate the person from the object may be challenging. And so they don't really get that clear information about what is happening. What the child might experience is an alert to movement as the parent comes near them and the cue of the sound of a plate once it's put on the table. So they might alert then to the presence of contrast or the color of the plate. They might be able to use smell to identify what their snack is. They could feel that same slimy texture if they pick it up to eat it, and then they'll taste the flavor and feel that oral texture as they chew. So who has the stronger concept of a banana? And the answer is the child who doesn't have CVI, because that child was able to incidentally pick up all of that rich visual information without description, without actually being involved. The child with CVI was able to taste it, smell it, feel the texture, but they didn't get clear visual representation and a real rich concept. And so it's our job as parents, as educators, to bridge that gap and ensure that our children are building stronger concepts. In thinking about that, we have to talk about near and distant senses. We'll be talking about vision, hearing, and touch primarily. So vision is a distant sense, meaning that we can gain information beyond ourselves. It can be outside of arm's reach. We can see beyond and get information. For hearing, hearing is also a distant sense. We can gain information outside of ourselves and outside of our sight lines. Touch is a near sense. We can only explore what's within arm's reach. So you might be thinking with just those 3 senses alone, how touch might be the most primarily accessible form of exploration. And you might be thinking, well, how is that different in the case of ocular blindness versus CVI? And there's some similarities and there's some differences. So children who are blind from an ocular impairment and those with CVI both require direct instruction, both require a multisensory approach, and they both use auditory, tactile skills, and available vision if they can. But instruction differs with the child who is CVI for a very important reason. Vision is expected to improve. Visual information can become available to these children, and strong visual saliency can be taught, comprehended, and expanded upon. So while those auditory and tactile skills remain incredibly important for concept building, opportunities for the use of vision must be consistently made available in an accessible way. And that's where we really need to focus our attention. We use multimodal, multisensory approach, but give opportunities to vision. So I just mentioned multisensory. So all children benefit from multisensory experiences. It really helps solidify concepts. And children with CVI require those same experiences, but with specialized and individualized instruction that considers the impact of complexity on visual accessibility. So you think about that in terms of how you're going to present the information. One child who doesn't have CVI might be able to take an object, look at it, feel it, shake it, hear it, all at the same time. But children with CVI often benefit from a multisensory approach that challenges just one sense at a time. So given an opportunity to look, given an opportunity to listen, and given an opportunity to tactily explore it. And the ability to tolerate looking and listening, looking and feeling, or integrating all three depends on that individual child. And it also depends on the child's motor coordination, the environmental conditions, familiarity with task, presentation of task, the familiarity with materials, and the presentation of materials. And when children are engaging in these experiences, we have to think about engaging and understanding. Vision. We already talked about this. Looking does not mean understanding. I can look at something and not understand it. Hearing is the same way. You can alert to sound, you can hear sound, but it doesn't mean you understand what you are hearing. And touch. Touching objects also does not mean understanding. You can reach into your purse and touch something and know that it's your pen or your lipstick because you know you put it there. But if you're trying to touch something novel, you don't immediately understand what that is. So all of these areas, vision, hearing, and touch, have to be considered from a functional standpoint. And those evaluations can occur through essential evaluations. So there's some tools that identify the implications of CVI. There's Gordon Dutton's CVI inventory and Teach CVI's screening questionnaire. Then there's the functional vision evaluations paired with Dr. Christine Roman-Lancey's CVI range. And that really allows us to identify how the child is currently using their vision in relation to the 10 frequently observed characteristics of CVI. And the results of these assessments tell us which environmental accommodations the child needs, the appropriate and accessible visual learning media, adaptations of the object and material presentation, and implementation of appropriate teaching strategies to facilitate looking and advancing their visual skills. Next, there's the learning media assessment, the LMA, and this determines how efficiently a child is using their sensory channels to gain information and also drives learning media, and evaluates the child's use of their visual system, tactile system, and auditory system. And both the CVI range and the LMA need to be conducted by a certified teacher of the visually impaired who understands CVI and understands the implications that it causes, so that that assessment is taking those considerations into heart when driving recommendations and making decisions. So concept development begins with object interaction. In order to develop a concept of an object, we need to first know that objects exist, objects have permanence, objects differ, objects have labels, objects have characteristics, and objects have functional use. Without incidental access, we need to be really proactive as adults in bringing information to the child, with careful consideration for how they are uniquely impacted by CVI. So that drives the importance of having those evaluations and understanding exactly what the child needs in order to access visual information. So here's a slide that shows 6 areas of developing a concept around an object and some possible challenges caused by CVI. So when objects exist, a possible challenge could be the child's not given the opportunity to look. The objects are given without adaptation, or the child doesn't even know the object's there due to complex environments and the distance they are from the object. So in eating, if a spoon's approaching their mouth, the first interaction they might be having with that spoon is when it's touching their mouth and their teeth. They might not even know that a spoon really exists as a spoon. Then we think of objects have permanence. Objects may appear to vanish into clutter, and it could also be due to limited physical interaction. Once objects disappear, where do they go? Objects differ. So this could be a challenge due to limited explicit instruction as to why objects differ, limited opportunities for access, and an impact of crowding. If there's too many objects together at once, they don't appear as individual, and many children with CVI have immense difficulty with this. Objects have labels. So labels and language can be missed due to fast routines. So the teacher, the parent, the caregiver might be labeling the action, such as it's time to eat, it's time to drink, but are not labeling the item. So that leaves a little bit of a gap there in that concept. And then the inability, again, to connect distant sounds with objects. You hear something from the other room, but you don't understand what it is because you've never seen it or experienced it. Objects have characteristics. And that can be impacted due to the complexity of the object, complexity of the environment, the lack of explicit instruction as far as what makes objects the way they are, and just that small repertoire of really what is available to that child to learn from. And then last, objects have functional use. And this can be challenged due to reduced exploration opportunities, lack of explicit instruction again, being able to tie visual information to auditory and tactile experiences. So how can we support visual access in these areas for a child with CVI? Again, this has to be personally modified to meet the individual needs of the child. There's not one strategy that I can give that will fit every child. So again, essential assessments are very important. But as an overview, how do we make objects exist? We modify the environment, we modify objects, and we reduce the distance. We bring the objects closer to the child. We take a moment and pause and hold that spoon against the black background in the child's field of vision. Have them look before they use it. That shows the object exists. Objects have permanence, so increasing the participation in the retrieving, using, and replacing of objects. If the child drops a spoon on the floor, have the child help pick it up. If they're unable to see it because of clutter, teach skills such as searching with their hands or using color as a means to code where it could be. You could also be proactive and have a black table mat down, or just reduce the complexity of the table to help support visual identification and location. Objects differ, just holistically increasing visual, tactile, and auditory exploration. The more items you have to compare and contrast, the more you will understand their properties. Objects have labels, so using language scaffolding, labeling the object and then building up to tie other connections to language. You don't want to overwhelm them at once, but you want to provide enough information where they are able to tie their experiences to language. Objects have characteristics, so teaching saliency and comparative language, how a cup and a plate have very different properties, you have to teach that explicitly. Objects have functional use, so maintaining that active engagement with objects and opportunities to use vision. So that spoon gets presented, now that child should be helping to hold the spoon and bring it to their mouth as much as possible. Really trying to learn the function of particular objects and using vision to support the identification of those objects to begin with. And it's very important that concepts are developed initially, especially through meaningful interactions. We are very, very motivated to attend and learn about concepts that are meaningful to us. And we also have to present them in a meaningful way. So I have two photos here, one of a child swinging happily on a swing outdoors, and then in the other picture, a child holding a miniature toy swing. The child who's on the swing is going to have a deeper concept of the swing. They're tactually engaging with it. They're being swung back and forth and getting that sensory experience, the wind against their face, the feeling of their weight in the swing. The child holding a miniature swing might be able to play with that in a pretend play fashion, but without actually ever having used a swing or experienced it, that concept still is not full. And I've seen people in the past start to provide children with CVI with miniatures saying, well, you know, this looks exactly like the swing that they use, so I'm going to use this as a means to describe what a swing is. And that's really our bias as typically sighted adults. We can look at that tiny swing and compare it immediately to swings that we've experienced in our life, but we've had a lot of experience and a lot of visual opportunities. So it's something we have to be extremely mindful of in programming for these children. In thinking about multisensory approach and thinking about tactile exploration, we have to think about what that involves. This photograph here of a palm placed on top of a cup on a table is not exploration. It's feeling, it's touching. And when you only are able to place your hand on top of one area or surface, the only tactile information you're getting is what's touching your palm or your hands. And some children, many actually, aren't able to fully tactily explore and manipulate objects. And that's completely acceptable. But what we need to think about is, for those children, how are we really upping visual access and auditory access and tying it to that very minimal tactile experience? For that child, tactile symbols and learning materials that really rely on a fine tactile discrimination might not be appropriate. So it's just one point of consideration. Now this slide shows really rich tactile exploration. So in this case, the child's holding a cup, and they're putting the cup in different orientations, flipping it over, putting their hands in the cup, holding the rim. And by doing that, they're exploring those attributes of that cup. So even if the young child doesn't know the function yet, they're learning that this object looks different from different perspectives and feels different and has different attributes. The same type of exploration has to occur for vision as well. So I have 6 pictures here of different perspectives of a cup. The child must learn that a cup is still a cup depending on its presentation. And that really takes methodical and explicit teaching, learning the cup in one position, learning the properties of that cup in that position, and then having the ability to actually feel it and look at it. And that's the difference with CBI. The child might want to physically explore it and then look at it. Change the orientation, look at it, feel it, talk about it. Language builds concepts. Next, we have to consider again how experience and context matter. So we already talked about how we constantly take past visual experiences to make sense of new experiences. And we make visual predictions very often based on context. So in the pictures I provided below, no one here has ever seen the inside of my cupboard, but you can look at this picture and say, I see many cups, therefore that bottom blue circle must also be a cup. So I can reach in and take that and know that it's something that I can use to drink from. And then on the other side, I have a picture of plants and a flower pot outdoors. We can immediately look at that picture and say, that's a flower pot, it's outdoors, it's got a rim that's bigger than a drinking cup, it's for planting, it's not for me to drink. Children with CVI need to learn that explicitly. If they've never learned that a cup can be represented in many visual forms and be tied to different functions, then that concept's lost, and you might have a lot of confusion as far as being able to separate them visually and functionally. And then there's failed predictions. So you can, again, look in that cup cupboard, see those translucent cups stacked, and see that green circle that looks similar to the blue circle on the other side and say, that must be a cup. And then you pull it out, and lo and behold, it's not. It's a container of baby food. So errors with CVI can occur for a number of reasons. That could be due to crowding, an inability to recognize saliency, and guesses might be made on the general location of where a cup should be, the color of the item, or just being based on the gross form. And these failed predictions, they occur, and when they do occur, that's a wonderful teaching opportunity. If they pull out the container, that's an excellent time to say, no, that's not your cup, that's the baby food container. Here's your cup is smaller, it has an opening. The baby food container doesn't. It has a green cap on top. We also have to think about generalization and variation in function. So just because a child knows their own cup in a very particular color in a very particular place, doesn't mean that they're gonna recognize cups in any environment or any shape, color, or area. That has to, again, be taught explicitly. So on this screen, I have a blue sippy cup, a solo cup, a very large pitcher, and a measuring cup. And we can look at this and know the function, and we know who they could belong to, because they do give social implications, such as I could look at the blue sippy cup, and if I saw an adult walking down the street drinking that, I would say, that's socially atypical. So children need to also understand functions and social nuances. We have to think about compensatory responses as well. So a child might open their mouth for a drink from a cup due to the context, being in the kitchen, and the predictable routine. They eat and drink every morning for breakfast. It might be based on auditory cues, so the pots and pans going, parents' verbal cues saying time for a drink, the movement of the parent near them, the movement of the cup near their mouth, or the touch of the item to their mouth. A child might also tap a switch or touch or glance at a picture or photograph of a cup to request a drink. And this could also be based on the reasons listed above, in addition to maybe color coding, memorizing the color and location of that cup picture, or the learned routine of if I touch this, I get a drink. And compensatory skills are very, very, very valuable. We want to build them. We use them all the time. But we want to make sure that we know that that does not guarantee visual recognition or a full concept. Just because they can anticipate and respond and use these clues doesn't mean they're recognizing the objects or understand the full concept of what is occurring. So what does this all tell us? It tells us that we need to build repeat opportunities for visual access. We need to support visual predictions by building connections, and we need to prepare children for failed predictions. So when a child wrongly retrieves an item thinking it's something else, How do we teach them compensatory skills to figure out where the item they want is, and use that opportunity to describe why the object they picked is different from the one they intended to find? We need to provide these children with hands-on experience with multiple objects. We need to increase physical and active participation in routines as much as possible. And we need to use and teach comparative language, linking everything together. So when do we teach concepts? Concepts are developed across all environments, all activities, and any time of day. However, for the child with CVI, loud or visually busy environments may not be conducive for building new visual concepts. So in those situations, you want to provide the opportunity to use vision and respect the child's participation. So we give the opportunity, but if it's not available at that moment for the child, then we encourage the auditory and tactile exploration. So they're getting some information from that activity. The child may also require breaks due to visual fatigue, depending on what they're doing or what the task is. And then the considerations surrounding the presence of anxiety or illness or recent seizures. These all may impact the child's ability to visually attend. We want to build concepts into routines because routines happen from dusk to dawn, and there's multiple opportunities for exposure daily. Routine provides context and it provides control. Repeat routines support retention and support the ability to recall events. They easily allow for active participation and engagement from the child. They build sensory experiences, so building that visual memory, auditory memory, tactile memory, builds anticipation and supports that visual prediction. I'm going into the bath, so we always use shampoo in the bath. I can expect to see my shampoo, and that's an opportunity to tie in those visual concepts with the whole experience. It ties emotions and feelings. Children can develop preferences and interests. They can make choices. They can say, I like this, I don't like that, and really have a full concept of what they're not liking or what they are enjoying. And most importantly, it builds language exposure and acquisition, because language, again, is the glue. It ties it all together and helps form a concept from that multisensory experience. So with all of this in mind, all of the strategies that I've spoken about, how could we go back to that experience of the banana preparation? And how could we change this child's concept of a banana? How could it look after a very rich multisensory experience that considerations their need for visual accessibility and the inclusion of specialized adaptations and instruction? Overall, they could have a much deeper understanding. They would imagine, well, bananas don't magically appear in my mouth. My mom prepares them and she brings them to me. Bananas are usually in the kitchen. If I see something yellow, it could be a banana. If I see something yellow in the bush outside, it's probably not a banana. Maybe it's a flower. And bananas can look different. They have different visual and tactile features when in a bunch, single, peeled, partially peeled, or cut up. The outside of the banana is yellow. The inside is white. The banana looks different depending on how I hold it. Bananas can be cut with a knife. A knife is a long silver tool that is sharp on one side and dull on the other. We use a knife on a cutting board and the sound goes tap, tap, tap. And then you can think about positions and spatial relationships too. The peel is on, now the peel is off. We pulled it off. We pull up, we pull down, etc. So by actively having the child participate, by bringing the materials to the child, by giving time to look, to feel, to listen, to be involved in every single step of that task, their concept of a banana will grow and grow and grow. And that's only one item. Imagine how that concept or that process could be applied to absolutely any object in your household alone. So in thinking about continuing to build concepts, the concept of objects can evolve over time and then be compared to other objects. So earlier I talked about the cup and the baby food. If you learned the concept of a banana, that gives way to compare it then to a cucumber. You're gaining more and more experiences to tie to one another, to tie comparative thoughts together. And as functional vision evolves, a child with CVI may be able to visually interpret 2D presentations of familiar objects. And it's the child who has had that extensive experience, who's watched that whole banana preparation project, who's been involved in it, who has that rich concept. That child's going to be the one making a choice or a selection from a 2D image and really understanding the concept behind it. Because many children can look at a picture of a banana and touch it and then be delivered the little round white pieces that mom cut up. But the child who can look at the banana and know that that one transforms into their snack has such a stronger concept that can then be applied to so many other settings. In thinking about access to photographs and pictures, I just want to provide a word of caution. So the transition from objects to photographs or pictures must be done methodically. Children may memorize color or gross form to make choices, and this does not mean visual recognition, nor is it evidence of a strong concept. Remember, concepts are different than skills. And initial learning must be founded with objects. It is the basis of all understanding. And again, those evaluations are required to identify appropriate and accessible media, so those visual assessments, and also having input from the child's speech language pathologists who also understand CVI or who can work collaboratively with the CVI specialist to make decisions as far as what is appropriate and accessible for that child. So when we're given the child strong visual, auditory, and tactile experiences, what are we giving them? We're giving them access. We're giving them independence. We're empowering them and building self-determination to make meaningful choices. We're building rich communication. We're supporting social skills and a positive self-concept. I don't know how many people who are watching have ever heard a joke and not understood it because you didn't have the conceptual background to get the joke, but it doesn't feel great. So even in the case of the banana, having that full understanding and concept of a banana and the language behind it gives a child access to jokes and socialization and understanding and being part of the group and knowing why other children are laughing and being able to engage and laugh with them. So in this joke, why did the banana go to the doctor? Because it was not peeling well. So in order to get that joke, you need to know all about the concept of a banana. You also need to understand the concept of the doctor and the language tied to a doctor, such as feeling well or not feeling well. So in conclusion, we build concepts, and concepts build outwards and upwards. They're occurring at all points in the day across many different objects, interactions, and people. When we think of CVI, we have to provide accessibility based on adaptations that came from assessment. We need to use the information from those assessments to provide access to repeat sensory opportunities, being able to look, to touch, to listen. We need to encourage the child and give opportunities to be active participants, hands-on experience, making that banana snack, hands-on experience, pouring themselves a drink and then using the cup to drink from. We have to base those initial concepts with meaningful objects. So using objects in routines, using objects that the child has experience with and that they can ultimately tie the visual appearance to the function. We need to give rich language and tie that language to objects and actions because that's what's going to solidify the concept and that's what can be used for comparative language to learn new concepts. And we take all of those steps and we apply what we know to new information so that we can make sense of new visual information and new situations and experiences. Thank you very much.